He had asked for nothing more than a simple favor. Yet that quiet request was about to leave the city's elite frozen in silence, utterly unprepared for what they were about to witness. The 47th floor of Crawford Defense Corporation gleamed like a shrine to American power. Crystal chandeliers bathed the mahogany walls in golden light, while floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city sprawling beneath like conquered territory. Tonight, the headquarters had transformed into a theater of wealth and influence, a shareholder gala and charity auction that lured the city's richest like moths to flame. 200 guests mingled in their armor. Armani suits priced higher than most people's annual rent, gowns straight from Paris and Milan, jewelry designed to dazzle as much as to dominate. Defense contractors, bankers, old money aristocrats all gathered to toast another year of profitable patriotism. At the center of it all stood Karen Crawford, 45, razor-sharp in her $6,000 power suit. Her blonde hair was tied back in a boardroom-perfect cut, her smile polished into a weaponized blend of warmth and authority. She owned the room from her podium, her voice ringing with the crisp cadence of a born leader. "Ladies and gentlemen," she declared, gesturing toward a display of young soldiers' photographs, "tonight we celebrate not only Crawford Defense Corporation's record-breaking year, but the men and women who have served our great nation. Our veterans deserve our gratitude, our respect, and our support." The crowd murmured its approval. These people understood performance, and Karen was delivering theater worth every dollar of their donations. Behind her, a Steinway Model D Grand piano gleamed under the chandeliers, waiting for the string quartet hired to provide cultured background music. Jane Collins, 26, weaved through the crowd with a silver tray of champagne. Young enough to believe in change, old enough to feel cynicism pressing in, she kept her smile steady. Her event coordination job barely covered her student loans, but in this economy, work was sacred. Snippets of conversation drifted past: stock prices, Hampton's real estate, tax complaints. Charity auction prizes, Martha's Vineyard weekends, opera box seats, custom rifles lined the walls, each one priced higher than a working family's yearly budget. Then silence fell. Not suddenly, but in waves, conversations faltering, laughter dying mid-sentence as every head turned toward the service entrance. A figure stood there. Marcus Bennett. He looked like everything these people had spent their lives insulating themselves against. His army surplus jacket sagged with decades of wear, jeans patched with duct tape, combat boots dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. But it wasn't the shabby clothes that froze the room, it was the man himself. Despite his weathered appearance, Marcus carried himself like a soldier. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, his pale blue eyes scanning the room with the calm precision of someone trained to read terrain and threats. At 68, his gray hair was uneven, his face lined with years of hardship, sun, and wind-etched. With experiences this room of pampered elites could never imagine. Jane felt her breath hitch. Something about his eyes tugged at childhood memory. Her grandfather had looked at the world the same way. Too much seen, but still watching for more. "Security," someone whispered, the word breaking the silence like a prayer. Karen recovered. First, her composure snapped into place like armor. She studied the intruder with the cool calculation of a predator. Lesser executives would have panicked, but Karen Crawford knew opportunity when she saw it. Marcus stepped forward. His wet boot squeaked against the marble, defiance in every footfall. The crowd parted, not in respect, but instinctively, as one steps around something they don't want to touch. Tyler Bradford, the company's 38-year-old Kiyu, stood abruptly. Entitled, perfumed in wealth, his voice dripped disdain. "How the hell did security let this happen?" Karen raised her hand, halting the guards. This wasn't a disruption. This was theater. and she was already imagining how to turn it to her advantage. At the far end of the room, Henry Mitchell, 72, self-made, worth more than some nations, watched with uneasy stillness. His weathered hands clutched a whiskey he hadn't touched. His eyes narrowed on the intruder. "There's something about that man," he whispered to his wife, his voice carrying the weight of instincts that were rarely wrong. Marcus' eyes found the piano. The silence returned, heavy and sharp, like a guillotine blade cutting through the room. It wasn't admiration, not awe, recognition. The way a soldier might look at an old rifle pulled from storage. He walked toward the stage, without hesitation, each step echoing in defiance of the glittering marble around him. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through glass. At the piano he turned, his voice carrying across the hush. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I play it for food?" The words hung in the air, absurd enough to freeze the room. Then Karen smiled, not her polished stage smile, but something colder, sharper. And the laughter began, first hers high, bright, cruel. Then the others joined in until the whole ballroom rang with mockery, bouncing from mahogany to crystal like shattering glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen announced with theatrical flourish, "it seems we have a surprise performance. A street musician who believes he has wandered into Carnegie Hall." The crowd surged forward, hungry for spectacle. These people, insulated from discomfort their entire lives, relished the chance to sneer at someone beneath them. Tyler Bradford shoved through the throng, drunk on whiskey and malice. "This is priceless," he barked. "Street trash thinks he can touch a $200,000 piano." Laughter roared. A jeweled woman whispered loudly to her companion, "He probably thinks it's one of those player pianos you put quarters into." Another wave of giggles, but Marcus stood unmoved, his pale eyes calm and steady. He had survived artillery, starvation, and 18 months in a Japanese POW camp. The jeers of spoiled elites were less than background noise. Jane Collins felt sick. She'd seen this kind of mob cruelty before, the way groups turned savage when they sensed weakness. Her grandfather's words echoed. Veterans treated like broken toys, paraded only when their pain could entertain. She started forward, but the hotel manager Peterson grabbed her arm. "Don't," he hissed. "You'll lose your job before midnight." On stage, Marcus adjusted the piano bench, not clumsy, not tentative, automatic, practiced. Henry Mitchell, watching from the back, narrowed his eyes. This was no amateur. Tyler kept performing for his audience. "You know what fascinates me about the homeless? The delusions. This one thinks he's Beethoven. Bet he can't even spell piano." Another round of cruel laughter. Karen sensed the crowd's bloodlust and raised her hand like a conductor. "Here's what we'll do," she said smoothly, her voice slicing the air. "He wants to play for food? Fine. If he can move even one person in this room to tears, I will write him a check for $5,000 tonight." Gasps, murmurs. $5,000 was pocket change to them, but framed like this, it was the perfect prize. Impossible, humiliating. "And when you fail," Karen continued, her tone turning deadly sweet, "security will drag you out. And you'll crawl back to your gutter knowing your place." Excitement swelled. Bets were already being placed on how quickly he'd humiliate himself. Tyler raised his glass and mock toast. To personal responsibility and to tonight's entertainment. But Henry Mitchell felt a chill. He'd fought in Korea. He knew the stance of a man who had stared down death and never flinched. "Martha," he murmured, "something's not right here." No one heard him. The crowd was vibrating with anticipation. Jane's hand shook. Her grandfather's stories thundered in her chest. But she stayed rooted in place. Courage was expensive, and rent was due. Marcus sat down at the bench. The last of the laughter died away. Silence closed in again, sharp and expectant. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised like vultures circling their prey. Karen leaned to the edge of the stage, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Well?" she demanded. "What are you waiting for? Show us what you've got, maestro." Marcus lowered himself onto the bench, his weathered hands hovering above. The keys like a priest before an altar. Silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Then, without ceremony, he struck the first note, a single middle, key pure, resonant, liquid silver. It cut through the air with surgical precision, stilling the cruel anticipation like lightning tearing open the sky. This was no fumbling amateur. This was a man who knew the soul of a piano. The room shifted. Laughter faltered. Marcus' fingers flowed into a simple melody, "The Way You Look." Tonight, but played with such elegance that even the most untrained ear recognized mastery. Tyler Bradford tried to sneer. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, though doubt wavered in his voice. He knew enough to realize this was no accident. Marcus didn't pause. He launched into something far greater. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto. No, two, a piece so punishing, so demanding, that even seasoned pianists feared it. And yet his hands moved with impossible control, weaving music that was both storm and prayer. The air thickened. The scent of cruelty was gone, replaced by something else: fear, awe, reverence. Karen's painted face drained of color as she realized the humiliation she'd planned was unraveling into a miracle she could not control. Tears, real tears, sprang to eyes around the room. Jane felt her throat tighten. The music was memory, longing, loss, all the stories her grandfather had told her, suddenly alive. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes. A hedge fund manager blinked. Rapidly, unable to suppress emotions he hadn't felt in decades. This wasn't performance anymore. It was resurrection. Henry Mitchell stood slowly, his scotch forgotten. Something deep in his memory stirred, fragments of half-remembered tailies. He fumbled for his phone, scrolling frantically through old photos and military records. His wife watched as his face drained to ash. On stage, Marcus shifted again, now a haunting melody that carried the weight of foxholes and fallen comrades. Music born of battlefields, not classrooms. Music that couldn't be faked. Karen tried desperately to claw back control. "Well, anyone can memorize a few radio tunes," she snapped, her voice too brittle. But her words were swallowed whole by the crescendo. Marcus wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for ghosts. A defense contractor wept openly. His wife's mascara streaked down her face. The hedge fund manager let his tears fall unchecked, remembering his father's war stories. Jane stepped closer, pulled by something beyond. Reason recognition in the music. Echoes of her grandfather's voice. Henry finally found it. A grainy black and white photograph. A bombed-out church. A young Marine corporal at a piano, eyes steady, hands poised. The same eyes now fixed on the Steinway. "Dear God," Henry whispered, his trembling voice carrying into the silence. "It's him." Marcus struck the final chord. It lingered in the air like a prayer. This silence was different, reverent, sacred. Not cruelty, but respect. He turned to face the crowd and for the first time smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but a sad one etched with experiences none of them could comprehend. Jane's voice broke the stillness. That was beautiful. Marcus' eyes found hers, and she saw her grandfather in them. The same strength, the same sorrow. "Thank you, miss," he said quietly. "It's a song I learned a long time ago, in a place far from here." Henry Mitchell rose, phone trembling in his hand, the old photograph glowing on its screen. The past and present overlapped in that moment, an unbroken thread of music. Memory and survival. The caption on Henry Mitchell's phone read, Corporal Marcus Bennett, 1st Marine Division, entertaining troops at Guadalcanal, 1943. The hush in the room shifted again. The cruelty, the spectacle, the mockery, it had all been replaced by something far more dangerous, truth, and Marcus knew from long experience that truth was the most terrifying thing of all. Henry Mitchell stepped toward the stage, his phone trembling in his hands, his weathered face etched with awe. The photograph on the glowing screen seemed to bridge 8 decades. "Excuse me," Henry said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had commanded factories and boardrooms, now speaking with reverence. "May I ask your name?" Marcus looked at him. For a heartbeat, 2 warriors saw each other clearly across the years. "Bennett?" he said simply. Marcus Bennett. The silence pressed against the glass windows, heavy and unyielding. Henry's face went ashen as he lifted the phone. He turned so the crowd could see the photograph. "Ladies and gentlemen, you don't understand what you've just witnessed. This man is a legend. They called him the Ghost of Guadalcanal." A ripple of confusion passed through the glittering crowd. They knew hedge funds and political connections, but military history? That had never touched them. Henry's voice strengthened. During the war, there were stories. Stories of a Marine corporal who could conjure music out of ruins. A busted piano in a bombed church. An organ in a field hospital. Even just humming. In a bunker to drown out artillery fire. They said his music was a weapon against despair. Marcus remained still, hands folded on his knees. 75 years he had tried to bury those stories. Tonight, they clawed their way back into the light. Tyler Bradford sputtered first. "That's impossible. The records he'd be famous, he'd be dead," Henry finished quietly. "The records say Corporal Marcus Bennett was killed in action in November 1943. He volunteered for a suicide mission to draw enemy fire so his unit could evacuate the wounded. According to history, he never came back." The silence pressed down heavier. Karen Crawford's face drained of color, her perfect evening collapsing in her hands. "But not every record matched," Henry said, scrolling his phone. "Some Marines swore they heard piano music echoing through the ruins long after the report of his death. They said the Ghost of Guadalcanal still played for the boys who never made it home." Jane staggered forward, her voice breaking. "My grandfather. He served in the Pacific. He used to tell me about a Marcus, a musician who—" She froze, staring at the man before her. Marcus' eyes softened. "What was his name?" "Thomas Collins," she whispered. "Everyone called him Tommy." Marcus' voice cracked for the first time. "Tommy Collins, a damn good Marine." He drew in a breath. He talked about his granddaughter. Said she was going to change the world someday. Jane broke into tears, not polite dabs, but full, raw sobs. The grandfather she'd idolized had known this man, and this legend had just been mocked like trash in front of strangers who had never risked a thing. Karen finally found her voice, sharp and desperate. "This is absurd. Even if any of this is true, he's still just a homeless man begging for Henry." Cut her off, his voice like steel. "Mrs. Crawford, this man saved 73 lives. He held a position against an entire Japanese battalion for 6 hours, using nothing but music to mask troop movements and trick the enemy into thinking reinforcements had arrived. When ammunition ran out, he played louder. The shame that followed was suffocating. The golden light of chandeliers seemed to dim beneath it. Marcus rose from the bench, brushing dust from his old jacket. For the first time, he fixed his pale blue eyes on Karen. The weight in them made her take a step back. "You want to know what happened after the war?" he asked softly. "I spent 18 months in a Japanese prison camp, survived on rice and water. watched good men die of disease and starvation. And through it all, we kept each other alive with music humming half-remembered songs, tapping rhythms on bamboo walls. He stepped closer, and the crowd parted before him. When I came home in '45, I learned my family thought I was dead. My fiancée had remarried. My job was gone. The GI Bill kept me afloat for a while, but the nightmares never stopped. Music was the only thing that made sense. Tyler tried to sneer again, but his voice quivered. Even if that's true, what does it matter now? You're still what? Marcus' voice cut him down. Still worthless? Still a drain? Still something you can dismiss because of how I look? No one moved. No one breathed. The room full of millionaires and power brokers suddenly looked very small. I've been watching this company for 5 years, Marcus said, turning back toward Karen. His voice was calm, but it carried a blade's edge. Crawford Defense Corporation. You've made fortunes off the backs of soldiers and veterans. Off men like me. Off men like Tommy Collins. Karen's face drained completely. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Marcus said. I'm stating facts. And there's something you all deserve to know about this auction. About where your charity money really goes. About who's been watching while you play games with people's lives. He turned back toward the piano, and the silence was absolute. His fingers hovered above the keys once more. But before we go any further, Marcus said quietly, I think I owe you one more song. This one's for Tommy Collins. And for every boy who never made it home to see what their sacrifice purchased. The silence deeper than ocean trenches locked the room in its grip as the first notes rose. It wasn't brilliance or virtuosity this time. It was taps, simple, pure, a melody carved into his soul from too many graveside ceremonies, from standing stiff-backed as friends were lowered into foreign soil. The sound carried weight, a haunting so raw it scraped across every heart in the room. And as those final notes faded, everyone understood the night wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Henry Mitchell's revelation still hung in the air, thick as smoke on a battlefield. What had started as a glittering corporate gala now resembled a tribunal, with Marcus Bennett at its center, not an entertainer, not a beggar, but a living ghost demanding judgment. The ghost of Guadalcanal, Henry repeated, reverent now. I've spent 40 years collecting artifacts of the Pacific Theater, and your story, Mr. Bennett, is legend among veterans. His trembling hand gestured toward Marcus. They said you could make a shattered piano sing like a cathedral organ, that your music kept men sane when the sky itself was falling. Marcus stood beside the Steinway, his hands resting on its polished surface, every inch the reluctant saint the room had made of him. According to official records, Henry continued, scrolling through his phone, Corporal Marcus Bennett was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. The citation reads, for extraordinary heroism in action during the Battle of Guadalcanal. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered, Corporal Bennett held position for 6 hours, using piano music to coordinate evacuations and sustain morale. His action saved 73 Marines. The ghosts pressed closer. Jane Collins stepped forward, tears streaming freely now. Tommy used to tell stories, she whispered, about a musician who played while the Japanese closed in, who made it possible for the wounded to escape. He said that man died. Marcus's voice broke at last. Tommy made it to the beach. Last thing I saw was his face looking back. He was crying. The room fractured under the weight of his words. Tyler Bradford, desperate to reclaim control, blurted out, this is touching. But even if it's true, which I doubt, he's still a homeless drifter begging for scraps. Gasps rippled. Even the ghosts recoiled. To call such a man a vagrant wasn't skepticism, it was blasphemy. Marcus raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. No, he's right to ask. What does it matter if I am just another broken veteran, another man left to rot? He stepped forward, eyes sweeping the crowd like a commander surveying enemy lines. You built fortunes on defense contracts, on the blood of soldiers. And yet you measure worth in zip codes and designer labels. The irony was acid on his tongue. After the war, he continued, voice steady, I tried to build a life. The GI Bill, music schools, odd jobs. But normal life doesn't exist for men who've carried ghosts this long. So yes, I drifted. Played in churches and bars, watched. His gaze pinned Karen Crawford. You want to know what a man learns when he spends 70 years invisible? He learns to see. The air shifted. The ghosts closed in. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, not for a crumpled note or broken relic, but for a sleek, modern phone, an object that looked alien in his scarred hands. His voice hardened. I've been watching you, Mrs. Crawford, watching this company, watching the games you play with blood money. 5 years of documentation, shell corporations, contracts bloated by 300%, supplies that never reached, veterans, empty warehouses where there should have been medical equipment, and consulting fees that, coincidentally, find their way back to you. Karen's face drained of color. You're lying, she hissed. You're just a bitter old man. Marcus's cold smile cut her to ribbons. Am I? Or would you prefer I show everyone the bank records, the email chains, photographs of the warehouses you swore were stocked? The silence that followed wasn't reverence anymore. It was execution. A courtroom without walls. Henry Mitchell's voice was brave as he stepped forward. Mr. Bennett, if you truly have evidence, I have 5 years' worth, Marcus interrupted. His pale eyes locked on Karen like a predator sighting prey. Names, dates, amounts, digital trails. Enough to bury every last one of you. Who profited from betrayal? He smiled again, but there was no warmth in it, only the chill of judgment. Tonight felt different. Inevitable. Jane stepped forward, her voice trembling but certain. You're not really homeless, are you? Marcus's expression softened. I have a home, Miss Collins. A small place outside the city. But I've spent most of my time living among the veterans, people like her. He nodded toward Karen. Claim? To champion. Listening. Documenting. Watching how the system fails them again and again. The ghosts pressing from the depths of history seemed to lean in closer, their presence heavy with unfinished business, demanding resolution. You see, Marcus continued, his voice adopting the cadence of a closing argument, when you're invisible, when the world writes you off as worthless, you can go anywhere, hear anything. People forget you exist, and that gives you access they'll never see coming. He struck a single chord on the Steinway sharp final. Not music, but judgment. A gavel falling. But there's one more truth you should know, he said, his fingers lingering on the keys. About who really owns 30% of Crawford Defense Corporation. About who's been watching, while you stole from the very men and women who bled for this country. A leather portfolio emerged from his worn jacket, its polished craftsmanship at odds with his weathered frame. He opened it with the calm precision of a man who'd negotiated far higher stakes than boardrooms. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the unyielding authority of a battlefield commander. Allow me to reintroduce myself. I am Marcus Bennett, Corporal, 1st Marine Division, United States Marine Corps, and I am the majority stakeholder of Bennett Investment Holdings, holder of 30% of Crawford Defense Corporation. The truth, cutting through lies like a blade, sliced Karen. Crawford opened where she stood. Her face went chalk white as realization struck. 30% meant voting rights, board access, unrestricted oversight. Everything she had hidden was now exposed to the one man she had tried to humiliate. Tyler Bradford's glass slipped from his hand, exploding across the marble floor. That's impossible. He-S-T-A-M-M-E-R-E-D. Marcus didn't flinch. Bennett Investment Holdings. Established 1963. Seated with my military death benefits. Grown through a few wise technology investments. Being legally dead for 20 years has its advantages. Henry Mitchell edged forward, his instincts as a collector sharpened by decades of spotting truth from forgery. His eyes scanned the documents, and his voice carried disgust. These records, they prove systematic theft, half a decade of embezzlement. The room tilted. Karen wasn't just being accused, her entire empire was being dismantled before 200 witnesses. Mrs. Crawford, Marcus said, his tone as cold and precise as a prosecutor's. Your fraud has been creative, I'll grant you that. Inflating VA supply contracts by 300%. Delivering expired medications. Pocketing funds through shell corporations. Prosthetic limbs that exist only on invoices. Dialysis machines rerouted to clinics you own. His pale eyes locked on her. Impressive. From a purely criminal standpoint. Karen snapped, her voice shrill. Lies, all of it. I've dedicated my career to veterans. No, Marcus said evenly. You've dedicated it to profiting from the suffering. Each word struck like a blade, drawing blood. The ghosts. In the room roared. Jane instinctively lifted her phone, recording. Training told her. This was history being rewritten. How much? She whispered. Marcus flipped through his papers, his voice methodical. 2.3 million. Embezzled. In 5 years. Money Congress allocated for rehabilitation, housing, and care. Stolen. While veterans slept under bridges. The last of Karen's composure shattered. She looked around wildly for allies, but saw only faces hard with betrayal. Tyler tried one. Last defense, clinging to privilege. Surely this can be negotiated, privately, without federal involvement. Marcus smiled without warmth. That option expired 10 minutes ago. Right on cue, the elevator doors parted with a chime. 6 FBI agents spilled into the room, their movement sharp, surgical. Badges glinted under chandeliers as they spread across the floor. Special Agent. Morrison strode forward, his voice carrying professional respect. Mr. Bennett, the warrants are ready. Teams are in place at all target locations. The truth, unyielding, merciless, had been given teeth. Karen staggered back, watching as agents began securing hard drives, seizing files, pulling devices from her assistants. The empire she had built from other people's pain was being razed. Before her eyes, this was all a setup, she whispered, broken. The piano, the performance, the humiliation, all of it calculated. Marcus's gaze was steady. No, justice was calculated. The humiliation? That was yours alone. I only asked to play for a meal. You chose to turn it into entertainment. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll need everyone to clear the floor while the warrant is executed. Agent Morrison announced, his tone calm but firm. This investigation has taken months of coordination, and we appreciate your cooperation. Before the crowd could move, Marcus lifted his hand, stopping them with a quiet authority that carried more weight than the FBI's command. Agent Morrison, he said evenly, if you'll allow me just one more moment, the truth still has work to do. He turned toward Jane Collins, and for the first time that evening, his hardened features softened. Miss Collins, he began, voice lowering to something deeply personal. During those endless nights in the Pacific, your grandfather Tommy spoke often about you. He told me of a granddaughter blessed with intelligence, resilience, and a heart determined to make a difference. He made me promise, if I ever found you, I'd see that you were given the chance you deserve." Jane's eyes welled with tears. Marcus continued, pulling a document from his leather portfolio. "I've watched how you work, how you lead, how you care for others. Crawford Defense, soon to be reborn as Pacific Defense Corporation, needs leadership that puts veterans first. This," he held out the contract, "offers you the role of Director of Veteran Affairs. Full authority to rebuild every program that corruption destroyed. Salary, benefits, everything. The only question, does this interest you?" Jane trembled as she read, her disbelief written across her face. What she held was no dream, it was real. "Yes," she whispered through tears. "Absolutely yes." The room shifted. What had begun as an expose was now becoming a rebirth. The truth, sharp and unrelenting, was carving out new possibilities from the wreckage. Henry Mitchell stepped forward, voice steady but thick with admiration. "Mr. Bennett, would you allow me to serve on your board? No compensation. Just the chance to make sure this kind of abuse never happens again." Marcus gave his first genuine smile of the night. "Your experience would be invaluable, Mr. Mitchell. I'd be honored." Meanwhile, federal agents led Karen Crawford and Tyler Bradford away in handcuffs. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Guests had come expecting champagne and piano music, only to witness the fall of an empire and the rise of something entirely different. Agent Morrison clasped Marcus's hand firmly. 5 years undercover, living as one of the forgotten, just to bring justice, extraordinary. "Not extraordinary," Marcus corrected quietly. "Necessary for Tommy Collins. For thousands of others who trusted people like Crawford, only to be betrayed." The truth, cutting through lies like a blade, had done its work. As the ballroom emptied, Jane lingered by the Steinway piano, the same instrument where the deception had unraveled. "Mr. Bennett," she asked softly, "would you play something? For my grandfather?" Marcus sat, fingers brushing the keys. The first notes of Amazing Grace filled the room, slow, deliberate, aching with history. Grace, he knew, sometimes required truth. And truth often demanded a sword. Justice had been served. 18 months later, Pacific Defense Corporation looked nothing like its former self. The marble shrine to greed had been replaced with a headquarters dedicated to service. Marcus refused the corner executive suite, choosing instead a modest office overlooking the Veteran Services District. From his desk, he reviewed quarterly reports that told a story unthinkable just a year and a half earlier. Karen Crawford now served a 15-year federal sentence. Her $12.7 million in stolen assets seized and redirected into veteran programs. Tyler Bradford had received 10 years and a lifetime ban from federal contracts. The stolen funds, now tripled by penalties and interest, were fueling programs with enough stability to last 2 decades. Jane Collins, once an overlooked event coordinator, had become something historic. As Director of Veteran Affairs, she rebuilt the company from the inside out. Under her leadership, Pacific Defense had shifted from profit-driven exploitation to advocacy on a national scale. She stepped into Marcus's office, tablet in hand. "Third quarter's finalized," she said, her voice carrying a confidence that made her grandfather's promise real. "This year alone, we've secured housing for over 2,300 veterans. Job placements are at a 96% success rate with salaries above the regional average. And the mobile medical units?" She smiled. 17 cities served, prescription coverage at nearly 100%. Marcus nodded slowly. For him, the numbers mattered, but what mattered more was the transformation of spirit. This was no longer a corporation. It was a lifeline. Through the window, he glanced at the same homeless shelter where he still volunteered as Marcus the Piano Man. None of them knew the truth that the quiet man playing music was the same one orchestrating millions in veteran aid. And he preferred it that way. Henry Mitchell appeared at the doorway, no longer the image of a stiff industrialist, but a man reborn. His investments and purpose now aligned with ethical service. The change wasn't just within the company, it was spreading, reshaping what people thought possible in business and community and justice. Because sometimes, truth really does cut through lies like a sword, and when it does, it leaves behind not just justice, but redemption. If this story struck you, if it made you think about the unseen battles in your own community, don't forget to subscribe to Listen HOA Stories. Together, we'll keep uncovering the truths that others tried to bury. At 74, Marcus Bennett had finally found a purpose far greater than wealth or prestige. After decades in business, he had turned his skills towards something lasting, rebuilding lives. Marcus, Henry said, presenting a leather-bound report with the reverence of a historian delivering a sacred text. The board's annual assessment is complete. We've achieved what no other defense contractor has even attempted: full transparency, zero compliance violations, and employee satisfaction ratings that rival the Fortune 500. The report detailed the transformation of Pacific Defensa, company reborn, one that measured its success not by profit margins but by lives changed. Government contracts were now awarded not for cutting costs but for improving outcomes: housing, jobs, medical care. Business schools at Harvard, Wharton, and Stanford had begun teaching Pacific Defense as a case study in stakeholder capitalism. Congress had even passed new laws modeled after Marcus's reforms. Yet, Marcus's greatest satisfaction wasn't written in any ledger or law. Every Friday evening, he walked 3 blocks to a homeless shelter where the residents knew him only as the old man at the piano. Sometimes Jane joined him with her violin, filling the room with music that blurred the line between those who served and those who were serving. Henry's voice softened. There's more. The Guadalcanal Memorial Commission has approved the restoration project. They'll rebuild the chapel where you played during the evacuation. They want you named as the principal honoree. Marcus studied the renderings, the familiar outline of the Pacific Chapel, a piano restored at its center. It was the very instrument that had guided 73 people, including Tommy Collins, to safety. I don't need monuments, Marcus said quietly. This isn't for you, Henry replied gently. It's for those who need to remember that real service rarely announces itself, that true strength isn't inherited, and that appearances can deceive. Coming home at last, Marcus realized, meant recognizing his story had grown beyond himself. It had become proof that systemic change was possible when power served sacrifice instead of exploiting it. As sunlight slanted across his office windows, Marcus closed the report and prepared for another evening at the shelter. He had once held 30% of a major corporation while sleeping in soup kitchens, living invisible among those society had written off. That irony had taught him the truth. Dignity cannot be bought, character cannot be inherited, and wealth means nothing without service. Jane was waiting with her violin. Together, they would play for people who understood loss, but also the healing power of music. Marcus Bennett, Marine, reformer, and the piano man nobody suspected had finally come home. For the first time in 80 years, he was exactly where he belonged. This story reminds us that people are rarely what they seem, and the greatest heroes often walk among us unseen. Have you ever discovered someone was completely different from how they appeared? Share your story in the comments below, and let's celebrate the hidden heroes in our own lives. The silence didn't fall all at once. It crept across the ballroom, like a spreading crack in glass first at the service entrance, where a figure appeared as though conjured from the forgotten edges of the city. Conversations faltered, laughter sputtered, and one by one, heads turned until every gaze was fixed On the doorway, Karen Crawford's speech stalled mid-sentence. Her carefully rehearsed words dangled uselessly in the air. Marcus Bennett stood on the marble threshold. At first glance, he looked like everything this crowd had spent their lives avoiding. An old army jacket, threadbare and torn at the elbows. Jeans held together with duct tape. Combat boots soaked from the rain, leaving muddy imprints on the pristine marble footprints of a world these elites only glimpsed through bulletproof glass. But it wasn't the clothes that froze the room. It was the man inside them. Marcus carried himself with a soldier's stillness, his back straight, his shoulders squared. His pale blue eyes scanned the crowd not with awe or desperation, but with the quiet calculation of someone who had learned long ago to read terrain and threats in places where hesitation meant death. At 68, his hair had gone to silver and his face was a roadmap of storms weathered and battles endured. Jane felt her breath catch. Those eyes, she knew them. Her grandfather had worn that same watchfulness, the gaze of a man who had seen too much and still braced for more. Security. Someone whispered, the word trembling like a prayer. Karen recovered first. Her mask of composure snapped into place like polished armor. Where others saw intrusion, she saw opportunity. This wasn't a disaster, it was theater. A chance to turn humiliation into entertainment. Marcus took a single step into the room. His wet boots squeaked against marble, the sound slicing through the stillness. The crowd parted instinctively, not out of respect, but revulsion, the way one skirts around a puddle. From the VIP table, Tyler Bradford rose. At 38, he wore his privilege like cologne, loud, suffocating, impossible to ignore. How the hell did security let this clown in? He muttered, just loud enough to draw chuckles. The guards moved, but Karen raised a manicured hand. No, she purred. Let him come, her eyes gleamed. This was better than any keynote, better than fireworks. These people paid fortunes. To feel superior tonight, she would give them a spectacle. At the far end of the hall, Henry Mitchell sat with his whiskey untouched, studying the intruder with a furrowed brow. 72 years old, worth billions, Henry had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts whispered caution. There's something about that man, he murmured to his wife. Marcus's gaze found the grand piano. The room seemed to tighten around him as he approached it, his footsteps steady, unhurried. He paused at the instrument, resting one hand on its polished surface, and turned toward Karen. Excuse me, ma'am, he said. His voice was weathered but firm, cutting cleanly through the hush. May I play? For food? The words hit the air like a spark in dry grass. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Karen laughed out. It wasn't the warm, performative laugh she used for donors. This one was sharp, crystalline, cruel. It rang across the ballroom and, like a signal, drew others in. Soon the hall echoed with mocking laughter, bouncing off. Chandeliers and mahogany swelling into a symphony of scorn. Ladies and gentlemen, Karen announced, stepping into the spotlight with theatrical flourish, our gala comes with an unexpected encore. A street musician who believes he stumbled into Carnegie Hall. The crowd pressed forward, hungry for the show. Tyler raised his glass, sneering. This is priceless. Trash off the street touching a $200,000 piano. Laughter roared. A woman glittering in diamonds leaned toward her companion. He probably thinks you put quarters in it, she whispered, loud enough for Marcus to hear, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard the screams of dying men, survived starvation. In a POW camp, lived through horrors these pampered elites could never imagine. Their laughter was nothing but static. Jane's stomach turned. She had seen this before, the cruelty of crowds when they smelled weakness. Her grandfather had warned her. Sometimes society looked at veterans like broken toys, curious only in their brokenness. She took a step forward, but Peterson, the nervous hotel manager, grabbed her arm. "Don't," he hissed. "Stay out of this or you'll be out of a job by midnight." Meanwhile, Marcus adjusted the piano bench. Not clumsily, not like a drifter bluffing at performance, but with the casual precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Henry Mitchell's eyes narrowed. This wasn't chance. This was memory. And then the room braced, waiting to see what would happen when the shabby old stranger touched the keys. Tyler swirled his whiskey, savoring both the burn and the attention. "They always have delusions," he sneered. "This one probably thinks he's Beethoven. Bet he can't even spell piano." The laughter crashed around Marcus like breaking glass, sharp and merciless. But his expression never changed. He stood, rooted in silence, the patience of a man who knew how to wait for orders, for openings, for the exact right moment. Karen's smile widened. She could feel the crowd's hunger, and she knew how to feed it. Exploiting people's worst instincts was her currency, and tonight was no exception. "You know what?" she said, her voice slicing through the noise like a conductor's baton. "Let's make this educational. Let's show everyone what happens when someone refuses to accept their limits." The ballroom hushed, the cruelty shifting from casual mockery to something orchestrated. Karen wasn't just enjoying this anymore, she was conducting it. "Our friend here wants to play for food," she announced, her tone dripping with false magnanimity. "Well, I believe in earning what you get, so here's the deal." Her eyes locked with Marcus's across the crowd. Something flickered their recognition. Both understood this wasn't entertainment. It was a test. If you can play well enough to draw even one tear from a single person in this room, Karen declared, her words swelling with theatrical grandeur, "I will personally hand you $5,000. Cash." Gasps and murmurs rippled. To these people, $5,000 was a bar tab, a handbag, a weekend splurge. But offered as a prize to a man they assumed would fail, it was a masterstroke of cruelty. "And when you fail," Karen added, dropping her voice to a hushed whisper that carried across the marble hall, "security will throw you out like the gutter trash you are. And you'll remember tonight as the day you learned your place." The crowd erupted with laughter, but now it had the fevered anticipation of spectators before an execution. Tyler raised his glass in a mock toast to personal responsibility and the priceless entertainment of watching a beggar fail in public. In the back, Henry Mitchell's scotch sat untouched. His instincts prickled. He'd seen men break, and this wasn't it. Marcus's posture, his calm, the complete absence of fear, this was something else entirely. "Martha," he murmured, "there's something wrong here." But his warning was drowned in the swell of cruel excitement. Bets passed across tables. Phones lit up. People leaned forward, not to hear music, but to watch a man unravel. Jane stood at the edges, her pulse hammering. She thought of her grandfather's stories veterans discarded, carrying invisible wounds society refused to see. She thought of speaking up, of quitting this job, of doing anything but watching. But courage was a luxury she couldn't afford at 26. Drowning in rent and loans. At the piano bench, Marcus moved with quiet precision. His weathered hands hovered over the keys like a priest over sacred relics. The laughter ebbed into a taut, expectant silence. Karen's voice cut the air. "Well, what are you waiting for? Show us what you've got, maestro." Marcus lowered his hands. The silence stretched thin as a wire. Then, without warning, he struck the first note. It wasn't what anyone expected. A single middle C, pure and resonant, hanging in the air like liquid silver. The sound cut through the ballroom's cruelty with surgical precision. This wasn't fumbling. This wasn't amateur. This was command. The laughter died in throats. Conversation stuttered into silence. Something impossible was happening. Marcus's fingers flowed across the keys, shaping the melody of The Way You Look Tonight. Not flashy, not grandiose, just a quiet, aching beauty. Understated elegance that wrapped itself around even the most tone-deaf listener. Beginner's luck, Tyler muttered, though his voice trembled. He'd taken enough childhood lessons to know homeless men didn't play like this. Broken men didn't carry this kind of control. And then Marcus shifted. Seamlessly, the tender melody gave way to the storm of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece so notoriously difficult it broke seasoned pianists. It required not just skill, but years of devotion to master its emotional architecture. The room changed. The scent of blood before the feast curdled into something new, the metallic tang of fear. Karen's smile cracked. The humiliation she had orchestrated was slipping through her fingers. Tears shimmered, not of pity for Marcus, but from the raw, devastating beauty of his music. Jane's throat closed as the notes washed over her. It was her grandfather's war stories given voice, longing, sacrifice, and the ache of men forgotten by the country they bled for. In the front row, a diamond-clad woman dabbed her eyes with a trembling handkerchief. A hedge fund manager blinked. Rapidly, fighting against an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. This wasn't spectacle anymore. It was revelation, and Marcus, the man they mocked as broken, was its prophet. Henry Mitchell rose slowly from his chair, his phone trembling in his grip. The music triggered half-forgotten stories, whispers he dismissed as legend. His mind raced, connecting fragments into a picture too impossible to accept. "It can't be," he whispered, scrolling through old military archives, searching for the ghost of a truth. Henry's wife watched him with growing concern as the color drained from his face. Tyler Bradford wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at Marcus with the disbelief of a man watching the laws of nature collapse in real time. "This is impossible," he muttered. "No homeless man can play like this. It's not possible." But Marcus was only beginning. The music shifted again, morphing into something darker, older, haunting. The melody carried the weight of distant shores, foxholes soaked with rain, whispered promises between dying friends. This wasn't just music, it was memory carved into sound. Technique alone couldn't produce it, only experience, only sacrifice, the scent of blood before the feast was gone. What filled the air now was something sacred and terrible, as though the room itself had become a cathedral. Karen tried to seize control, her voice pitched too high. Well, anyone can memorize a few songs off the radio, but her protest was smothered beneath the swell of Marcus's crescendo. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for ghosts, for comrades who never came home, for a country that had forgotten its debts. Around the room, facades cracked. A defense contractor who had profited off war wept openly. His wife's mascara streaked down her cheeks. The hedge fund manager, once so smug, let tears fall unrestrained, blindsided by memories of his father's war. Stories he dismissed as sentimental nonsense. Jane drifted closer to the stage as if pulled by gravity. The music stirred fragments of memory she didn't know she carried. Her grandfather's voice telling her of a soldier who once turned a broken piano into heaven in the middle of hell. Recognition began to spread through the crowd, but it crystallized first in Henry Mitchell. His shaking fingers scrolled through his phone until he found it, a grainy black and white photograph. A young Marine corporal standing beside a piano in a bombed-out church. The hair was darker then, the body younger, but the eyes were the same. Henry's breath caught. Dear God, it's him. The last chord rang out pure and final, a prayer suspended in air. Silence followed, not cruel anticipation, but reverence. Marcus turned from the keys, and for the first time since entering the room, he smiled. It was a sad smile, heavy with truths no one else in this glittering cage could ever understand. "That was beautiful," Jane said aloud, her own voice trembling. She hadn't realized she'd stepped forward. Marcus's eyes met hers, and in them she saw her grandfather. The same quiet strength, the same sorrow. "Thank you, miss," Marcus said softly. "It's a song I learned long ago, in a place very far from here." Henry stood now, his phone trembling in his hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command softened by reverence. "May I ask your name?" Marcus regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. "Bennett," he said simply. "Marcus Bennett." The silence pressed against the glass like the entire city was holding its breath. Henry's voice shook as he raised the phone for all to see. "Ladies and gentlemen, do you understand what you've just witnessed? This man you mocked, this legend. They called him the ghost of Guadalcanal." Confusion rippled across the ballroom. These were people fluent in stock prices and boardroom politics, not battlefields. During World War II, Henry continued, his voice rising, there were stories from the Pacific. Stories of a Marine corporal who could wring music from ruins, an organ in a shattered field hospital, a piano in a church with its roof blown away. They said his music was a weapon against despair itself. Marcus sat motionless at the piano, his hands folded, his eyes distant. He had spent 75 years trying to bury those stories. Now they had been unearthed before 200 strangers. Tyler found his voice, though it cracked. That's impossible. Records would have shown it. He'd be famous. He'd be dead, Henry finished quietly. According to official reports, Corporal Marcus Bennett was killed in action, November 1943, a suicide mission to draw enemy fire while his unit evacuated the wounded. A stunned hush fell. Karen stood frozen at the stage's edge, her empire of control disintegrating grain by grain. This didn't fit her script. Legends weren't supposed to walk into her ballroom wearing duct-tape jeans. Henry's voice dropped to a hush. But the men who survived, they swore they still heard piano music in the ruins long after the report said he was gone. They swore the ghost of Guadalcanal was still playing. Jane's knees weakened. Her grandfather's words rang like thunder nautales of a soldier-musician who had saved lives, who had played through bombardments to keep courage alive. "My grandfather served in the Pacific," she whispered. He spoke of a Marcus who... Her voice broke. She stared at the man at the piano with new eyes. Marcus met her gaze, his own softening. "What was your grandfather's name?" She swallowed. "Thomas Collins. Everyone called him Tommy." The silence deepened, heavy with history, until it became unbearable. Marcus's composure cracked, just for a heartbeat, and grief flickered raw across his face. Grief that no decades could erase. "Tommy Collins," Marcus repeated, his voice thick with memory. "Good man. Damn good Marine." He paused, steadying himself. He used to talk about his granddaughter. Said she was going to change the world someday. Jane broke. Not the careful, polite tears of a socialite, but the raw, shaking sobs of someone whose entire world had just shifted. Her grandfather's stories weren't myths. They were living history, and the man who had carried them was standing right in front of her, treated like trash by people who had never risked anything. For anyone, Karen seized the silence like a drowning woman. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharp and desperate. "Even if any of this is true, he's still just a homeless man begging for handouts. Whatever he might have been, enough." Henry Mitchell's voice cut her down like a blade. His hand trembled, but his words carried the weight of command. "Mrs. Crawford, this man saved 73 American lives. He held a position against an entire Japanese battalion for 6 hours, with nothing but an old piano to signal troop positions and keep men alive. When ammunition ran out, he kept playing to make the enemy believe they were still heavily defended. Silence deeper than ocean trenches fell once again, but this time it was suffocating with shame. The room's golden light seemed to dim under its weight. Marcus rose slowly from the bench, brushing dust from his worn jacket. For the first time, he looked directly at Karen. His pale blue eyes carried such force that she stumbled back a step. "You want to know what happened after the war, ma'am?" he asked, his voice quiet but unflinching. "I spent 18 months in a Japanese prison camp, survived on rice and water, watched good men die from starvation and disease. Do you know what kept us going?" He let the words hang. "Music. Humming scraps of melodies we could barely remember. Tapping rhythms against bamboo walls. It was the only thing that reminded us we were still human." He stepped toward the edge of the stage. The crowd parted as if pushed by an invisible current. "When I finally came home in '45, my family thought I was dead. My fiancée had married someone else. My job was gone. The GI Bill helped with school, sure, but the nightmares never left. The only thing that made sense anymore was music." Tyler Bradford tried to muster his sneer, but his voice cracked. Even if all that's true, what does it matter now?" "You're still what?" Marcus's voice landed like a hammer. The room froze. "Still worthless? Still a burden? Still someone you dismiss because of how I look?" The silence grew heavier, pressing outward as though the entire city was holding its breath. People who had built their identities on wealth and power felt their illusions crumble. For the first time, they were forced to ask themselves if they'd gotten it all backwards. Marcus's voice softened, but its edge made Karen's blood run cold. "I've been watching this company for 5 years, Mrs. Crawford. Crawford Defense Corporation. You've made millions from contracts supplying the military off the backs of veterans like me." Karen went pale. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying," Marcus said evenly. "I'm stating facts. And there's something every one of you should know about tonight's charity auction, about where that money really goes, about who's been paying attention while you play games with other people's lives." He turned back to the Steinway, his hands hovering above the keys once more. "But first," his voice dropped to a near whisper, "I owe you one more song, for Tommy Collins, and for all the boys who never came home." Then the notes began. Not the virtuoso brilliance of before. Something simpler, older, more final. It was taps played with the reverence of a man who had stood at too many graves, who had listened to too many rifles fire over caskets draped in flags. The sound hollowed out the room. Executives and investors sat rigid in their designer suits, their illusions stripped away. The gilded ballroom had become a memorial. Henry Mitchell's voice rose again, thick with awe. "The ghost of Guadalcanal," he whispered, almost to himself. "I've spent 40 years collecting military history. Your story, your legend. It's spoken of among Pacific veterans like scripture. They said you could make a broken piano, sing like a church organ, that your music kept men sane when the world was collapsing around them." He raised his phone, reading aloud from a military citation. "The Navy Cross awarded posthumously for extraordinary heroism in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Despite being outnumbered, Corporal Marcus Bennett held his position for 6 hours, coordinating evacuations with piano music. His action saved 73 wounded Marines. The ghosts of history seemed to rise, filling the space with invisible witnesses. Jane stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. "Tommy used to say, there was a musician who saved his life. He said that man died so others could live." Her voice broke as she looked at Marcus. "He was talking about you." Marcus's composure finally cracked. He bowed his head, and for the first time, grief overcame him. "Tommy made it to the beach," he said softly. The last thing I saw before the bunker collapsed was his face looking back at me. He was crying. Tyler Bradford, desperate to reclaim control, barked out, "This is all very touching, but even if it's true, what does it change? He's still a homeless vagrant." The crowd gasped. The ghosts recoiled from his words, and several people turned on him with open disgust. But Marcus raised his hand, silencing the protests. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of eternity. And Marcus's voice was calm, but the undertone made Karen Crawford's blood freeze. What does it change? What does any of it matter? If I'm just another broken-down veteran. On the streets? He moved slowly across the stage, his gaze sweeping the room like a battlefield scan. Every executive, every socialite, every profiteer felt the weight of his eyes. They had built their fortunes on defense contracts on the very machine powered by men like him. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. After the war, he continued, I came home to find everything changed. The GI Bill paid for music school, but the nightmares made focus impossible. Tried to build a normal life, but normal doesn't exist for men who've seen what I've seen. So I drifted. Bars, churches, playing wherever I could. Karen lunged at the opening. So you admit it, you became a drifter. A vagrant. I became a watcher. Marcus cut her off. His tone forced her back a step. Do you know what someone learns after 70 years of being invisible, Mrs. Crawford? When you're dismissed as worthless, ignored as irrelevant, you learn to see, to listen, to notice what others think no one's watching. The crowd shifted uneasily. The ghosts of history pressed closer. Marcus's eyes no longer looked homeless, they looked calculating, patient, dangerous. For instance, he said, reaching into his jacket, you learn about shell companies. Contracts inflated by 300%. Supplies that never reach veterans. And executives who claim to care while quietly bleeding those programs dry. He pulled out not a cracked flip phone, but a sleek smartphone utterly out of place. In his weathered hands, I'm not implying, Marcus said, tapping the screen. I'm stating facts. For 5 years, I've documented Crawford Defense Corporation's embezzlement of veteran funds' dummy invoices, ghost contracts, warehouses supposedly full of supplies that are, in reality, empty. I have names, dates, bank transfers, everything. The ghost demanded justice now. You're lying. Karen snapped, her voice cracking. You're just some crazy old. Am I? Marcus's voice sliced her words apart. Would you like to see your own consulting fees routed through 3 shell corporations? Or explain the photos of empty warehouses billed to veteran hospitals at triple cost? The silence that followed wasn't awe. It was the silence of an execution chamber. Henry Mitchell stepped forward, his collector's instincts sharp despite the weight of revelation. Mr. Bennett, if you truly have evidence of criminal activity, I have 5 years' worth, Marcus said flatly. Every fraudulent invoice, every offshore transfer. I've been waiting for the right moment. His eyes locked on Karen. His smile was cold. Tonight felt right. Jane moved closer, her voice trembling. You're not really homeless, are you? Marcus's expression softened as he looked at her. I have a home, Miss Collins. A quiet place outside the city. But most of my time, I've spent with veterans people like her claimed to serve. Listening to their stories. Watching the system fail them again and again. The room seemed to vibrate with the weight of accumulated injustice. You see, Marcus continued, his words taking on the cadence of a closing argument. When society writes you off, you become invisible. And when you're invisible, you can go anywhere, hear anything, see everything people don't bother to hide because they assume you don't matter. He struck a single perfect chord on the Steinway. It wasn't the start of a song. It was a gavel, But there's one last thing you should all know, he said quietly, his fingers still resting on the keys. About who truly owns 30% of Crawford Defense Corporation. About who's been watching from the shadows all this time. The ghosts pressed closer. Waiting. Marcus reached into his worn jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, its expensive craftsmanship utterly incongruous with his facade. He opened it with the efficiency of a man who had negotiated higher stakes than any of them could imagine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a battlefield commander. "I am Marcus Bennett, former corporal of the United States Marine Corps' 1st Division, and I am also the majority stakeholder of Bennett Investment Holdings, controlling 30% of Crawford Defense Corporation." The truth cut through the room like a sword. Karen's color drained away. 30% meant board access, voting power, oversight. Her empire was no longer hers. Tyler's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering across the marble. That's impossible. "The shareholder registry lists buy holdings," Marcus replied with surgical precision. "Bennett Investment Holdings. Established in 1963 with my military death benefits and a few well-placed investments in emerging technologies. Being legally dead for 20 years has certain advantages when building wealth quietly." Henry Mitchell, instincts honed by decades of authenticating relics, studied the documents with reverent awe. "These are genuine," he said, his voice thick with fury. "These records show systematic theft stretching back half a decade." The truth was relentless. Marcus hadn't been exposing Crawford Defense from the outside. He had been dismantling them from within. "Mrs. Crawford," he said finally, his voice calm and merciless, "your creativity in fraud has been remarkable. Marking up medical supplies for veterans by 300%. Delivering inferior products or nothing at all. An elegant network of shell companies siphoning taxpayer money into your personal accounts. Truly impressive." The ghosts roared now. Their vengeance was almost complete. He said. "He's right to ask." From a technical standpoint, Karen's schemes had been intricate. But now her voice cracked into a desperate shriek. "These accusations are lies. I've dedicated my career to supporting military families. You've dedicated your career to profiting off their pain." Marcus cut her off, every word a blade. "Dialysis machines diverted from VA hospitals to private clinics you owned. Pain medication rotting in warehouses while veterans suffered. Prosthetic limbs that exist only on forged invoices." The truth, cutting through lies like a sword, drew blood with every strike. Jane Collins, instincts kicking in, raised her phone to record. Her training told her this moment would reshape headlines across the nation. "What's the total?" She whispered. Marcus checked his portfolio with the precision of a military accountant. $2.3 million. Stolen over 5 years. Money Congress appropriated for medical care, rehabilitation, and housing for those who served. The crowd recoiled. 200 witnesses now stared at Karen Crawford with disgust. She searched the room desperately for allies, but every face was hardened with betrayal. Tyler Bradford tried one last maneuver, clinging to entitlement. "Surely, these matters can be resolved privately without federal involvement." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "That option expired 10 minutes ago." Right on cue, the elevator doors slid open. 6 FBI agents stepped out in perfect formation, their badges flashing under chandelier light. The room fell into absolute silence as they moved with the precision of a tactical unit. Special Agent Morrison approached Marcus with the respect of one soldier to another. "Mr. Bennett, the warrant is ready. Our teams are executing raids at all associated sites." Karen's knees nearly buckled as agents began seizing computers, files, and devices. Her empire built on theft and lies was being dismantled piece by piece. This was orchestrated, she whispered in horror. The performance, the piano recital, all of it, a setup? I orchestrated justice, Marcus replied, his voice calm and final. The humiliation was all yours. Agent Morrison addressed the guests. Ladies and gentlemen, please clear the floor. This is an active investigation. We appreciate your cooperation. But before the crowd dispersed, Marcus lifted his hand. One last matter, Agent Morrison. The truth, cutting through lies. Like a sword, had one more task. He turned to Jane, his weathered face softening for the first time that night. Miss Collins, during those endless Pacific nights, your grandfather Tommy spoke of you constantly. He believed you'd grow into a woman of intelligence and compassion. He asked me to look after you, should fate allow it. Jane's eyes welled with tears. I've seen your work, your organization, your heart. Pacific Defense needs leaders who care about veterans, not predators who exploit them. From his leather portfolio, Marcus withdrew a contract. This offers you the role of Director of Veteran Affairs. $120,000 salary, full benefits, and authority to rebuild every program corrupted under Crawford. Jane stared at the document as if it were a mirage. Then she whispered, trembling, yes, absolutely yes. The truth was no longer destroying, it was rebuilding. Henry Mitchell stepped forward, admiration in his eyes. Mr. Bennett, may I serve on your board? Without pay. To ensure this corruption never happens again. Marcus smiled a genuine, warm smile at last. Your expertise would be invaluable, Mr. Mitchell. I'd be honored. As agents escorted Karen Crawford and Tyler Bradford away in handcuffs, the guests filed out in stunned silence. They had come for entertainment, and instead watched the destruction of a conspiracy orchestrated by a man they had mocked. Agent Morrison shook Marcus's hand firmly. 5 years of undercover work. Living among the homeless to gather evidence. Extraordinary dedication. It wasn't extraordinary, Marcus replied. It was accountability. For Tommy Collins, and for the thousands betrayed by people like Crawford, the ghosts of history were finally silent. Justice had been served. Jane approached the Steinway where it had all begun. Mr. Bennett, she said softly, would you play one more song? For my grandfather? Marcus sat down, his fingers steady. He played Amazing Grace, every note carrying the weight of sacrifice, redemption, and truth. Because sometimes grace requires truth, and sometimes truth demands a sword. The mahogany-paneled fortress of greed that once was Crawford Defense had been reborn into something unheard of in the industry, a headquarters designed not for profit, extraction, but for service. Marcus Bennett refused the executive suite. Instead, his office sat in the corner, its windows overlooking the city's Veteran Services District. Coming home at last wasn't about luxury. It was about purpose. The courts had spoken. Karen Crawford now served 15 years in federal prison. With every asset seized, $12.7 million redirected into programs she once plundered. Tyler Bradford drew 10 years and a lifetime ban from federal contracts. With civil penalties added, the recovered funds created an endowment strong enough to fund veteran services for 2 decades. Jane Collins had grown into something no defense firm had ever seen, a director of veteran affairs with both moral authority and operational power. Her division wasn't an afterthought, it was the company's beating heart. Mr. Bennett, Jane announced one afternoon, holding a tablet. Third quarter numbers are in. This year we've placed 2,300 veterans into permanent housing. Job. Placement success rate, 96%. Salaries averaging 18% above the regional median. Marcus listened, but his eyes drifted to the view beyond the shelter 3 blocks away, where every Friday he still played piano as just old Marcus. The quiet man who never spoke of corporations or battlefields, Henry Mitchell, appeared. In the doorway, transformed himself. The once stoic industrialist now wore casual clothes and carried a document bound in leather. "The annual board audit is complete," he said. "Full transparency, 0 compliance violations. Employee satisfaction higher than Fortune 500 averages. Harvard and Stanford are already teaching our model. And Congress? Well, they've written your testimony into law." Coming home at last had become more than Marcus's personal vindication. His undercover performance had sparked a movement systemic reform across an entire sector, but the victories Marcus cherished most remained. Unseen. Each Friday, he walked to the shelter. Sometimes Jane joined him, violin in hand, and together they filled the hall with music. Executives and homeless veterans playing duets, 2 worlds bridging through grace. One evening, Henry arrived with news that humbled even Marcus. "The Guadalcanal Memorial Commission approved the project," he said. "The chapel you played. Enduring the evacuation, it will be rebuilt as an international peace monument, and you, Marcus, are its principal honoree." Marcus studied the plans in silence. A restored chapel, a piano at its heart, a symbol of survival. "I don't need monuments," he said quietly. "It isn't for you," Henry replied. "It's for everyone who needs to remember that heroism doesn't advertise itself, that true service is often invisible." Coming home at last, Marcus realized, was never about a building or a title. It was about choosing every day to use whatever gifts you carried in service of those who had sacrificed and received nothing in return. As the sun dipped low, he locked his modest office and began the familiar 3-block walk. Tonight, Jane would be waiting with her violin, and together they would play for men and women the world had forgotten, reminding them, note by note, that dignity has no price tag. For the first time in 8 decades, Marcus Bennett knew he was exactly where he belonged. This story reminds us, appearances deceive, but service reveals truth. Have you ever discovered someone was completely different than they seemed? Share your story in the comments. We want to celebrate the hidden heroes among us. And that's today's story from Listen HOA Stories. If this tale moved you, hit that like button and help us bring more stories of unexpected justice and unseen courage to the world.